stream, you are very welcome. And I'd like to thank all of those who have participated in this summer's series. First and foremost, those who gave lectures: Tutor Lee Goldsmith, Tutor Dan Harrell, Tutor Bill Braithwaite, and tonight, Tutor Clara Picker. I'd also like to thank tutors Jonathan Badger and Patrick Coleman for having participated in a lively roundtable. And I'd also like to thank Tutor Paul Ludwig, Tutor Stella Zhu, Tutor Katie Kretler for delivering brief responses to some of the lectures this summer. I thought that was an interesting change, and we'll see if it works in the future. And I'm happy to take your feedback on that. But without any further ado, I'm happy to call to the podium the final lecturer in this summer's series. I'm happy to say a friend of mine and very fine tutor, Miss Clara Picker, who will be lecturing on Progress Without End, Rousseau on the History of the Human Species. Miss Clara Picker.
So, before I start, I would like to thank Mr. Brandon Boyle and Mr. Christian Candler, who both have read and commented on drafts of this lecture and have made it better. Okay. Since the topic of this lecture series is Phenomena of Modern Life and the Future of Liberal Education, the first task would appear to consist in saying a few words about how one's talk is related to this topic, what sort of phenomenon one assumes to be specific to modernity, and perhaps also what one takes modernity to be. And here one already encounters certain pitfalls. For although we are pretty sure that we do, in fact, live in modernity, and although most of us habitually use the adjective modern to designate a historically specific period, be it with reference to political thought, philosophy, art, or indeed life as such, it is not at all easy to fill this term with definite content when pressed to do so, and perhaps more importantly, to also give a sound justification for one's concept of modernity. When I first started working on my dissertation, which was then supposed to be on the certainly very modern idea of open-ended historical progress, I learned the hard way that whenever one declaratively pronounces a phenomenon as modern in character, and therefore as historically new, one is immediately confronted with a whole array of examples, emanating either from well-meaning but enthusiastically skeptical interlocutors, or from learned monographs that seem to have been written with the sole purpose of challenging the designation of a given phenomenon as new, examples that seem to prove that indeed everything has some historical precedent somewhere. Can you all still hear me? Okay. That somebody happens to know about, and therefore, really, there is nothing new under the sun. This is perhaps the reason why we often invoke technological innovations or technological progress when we seek some firm ground to at least establish that modernity is indeed a thing, if you will. For industrialized production, digitalization, smartphones, social media, radiation therapy, the atomic bomb, now those things are certainly very new. Their existence indeed seems to provide sufficient evidence to distinguish modernity from the periods that came before. But it might make sense to dwell a bit on the criterion of newness, of historical unprecedentedness itself. For indeed it seems that this self-consciousness of living in a historically novel and unprecedented period is itself something uniquely modern. In other words, perhaps not all, but certainly many of those people we regard as inaugurators of modernity also conceived of themselves in those terms and distinguished themselves from those they called the ancients. So perhaps we can start there. Modernity is characterized by a specific consciousness of historical newness, a newness that is conceived both as a fact and as a program, That is to say, as something that both is and that has to be actively brought about. One may think, for instance, of Descartes, who felt the need to do away not only with the philosophy that he had been educated in, but indeed with all philosophy that had come before him. Similarly, Bacon broke with the tendency so prevalent in the Renaissance to subordinate modern science to ancient wisdom. Bacon neither wished to return to nor to rebirth the wisdom of the ancients. Instead, he felt that the task at hand was to bring about something unprecedented, something entirely new, which, in turn, would create even more newness. Of course, humanity has now long lived in a Baconian world. It is a world that does not strike us as very new and exciting, but, I suppose, as rather old, as familiar, perhaps as stale. And when this world appears too self-satisfied, it can strike us as vulgar and mean. Can we still feel the boldness, the elan, the vitality of Bacon's program when we read the Novum Organum today? Yet novel things are often, perhaps more often than one would think, not brought about consciously, but rather accidentally in an attempt to restore something old, something that is thought better, perhaps purer than whatever exists in the present. In political history, this can be observed with those bourgeois revolutionaries who, in their self-understanding, were not trying to create something new, but rather to re-establish something old, an ancient liberty of the ancestors, or of a people they admire, whether this ancient liberty be real or imagined. Indeed, as Marx remarked in 1852, it seems that modern bourgeois revolutionaries felt the need to clothe themselves in ancient garb so as to work up the courage to face the tasks of their present, which were, precisely, to create something that had not hitherto existed before. Yet sometimes this, quote, conjuring up of the dead of world history, unquote, can also turn into parody, into a farcical cosplay. That is, it can constitute an elaborate way to evade those novel, present-specific tasks, and history can weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And this uneasy relationship with history, I want to suggest, is itself a phenomenon specific to modernity. We know that the world we live in today is very different from the world that existed a generation ago, and we expect, probably rightly, that the world the next generation inhabits will, in turn, be very different from the world we see today. In the words of literary critic Louis Menand, in modern societies, the ends of life are no longer given at the beginning of life. The idea is to make the world go forward, not around, or perhaps at least to prepare for and adapt to a world that does go forward rather than around. According to Menand, this circumstance leads to a profound crisis of meaning in modern societies, for we generally assume that our practices are historically contingent and time-bound, and we simply do not know what will count as valuable, as respectable in the future. While Menand's remarks primarily pertain to individual practices, I would like to suggest to you tonight that this crisis of meaning also manifests itself with respect to the history of the human species as such. After all, we are aware that our species, the Homo sapiens, has a very long history, at least 300,000 years, that it has undergone tremendous change since its emergence and changed its environment in equally tremendous ways, and that it will, most likely, continue to change in ways that are impossible to predict or to anticipate. If we, moreover, assume that the trajectory of these changes, of the development of our species, were not and are not directed by any providential force, but rather the outcome of a complicated interplay of internal mechanisms on the one hand and external circumstances on the other, that is, if we assume that the progress of our species does not have any inherent end or goal, what are we to make of this history? How ought we understand it? How ought we judge it? In other words, what is the meaning of human history? I believe that these are the core questions that Jean-Jacques Rousseau raises in his discourse on the origin of inequality. In his discourse, Rousseau gives us a new kind of history, a history not of the deeds of individuals or of the fate of nations, but rather of the human species itself, of the way our species, over time, fundamentally change the conditions of its own existence, and in consequence, also its own nature. This idea is rather unsettling when you think about it. For, as we will see, it implies that whenever we transform conditions external to us, we inevitably also transform ourselves. And there is no way to know, to predict, how the changes we enact will in turn act on us. Even more terrifying is the fact that this entire process, according to Rousseau, was done rather unwittingly. It was neither a choice on part of humanity, nor even of a subsection of humanity, nor was it guided by providence, nor, and here's where Rousseau differs starkly from the two philosophers he most frequently addresses himself to, Thomas Hobbes and Samuel Pufendorf, nor is there anything in human nature that directly or indirectly pushed or nudged us in the direction our species ultimately took. It simply happened, and one might suspect that something like this is still happening today. Now, the unsettling effect of this idea or argument that our species has unwittingly changed not only the conditions of its existence, but also its own nature, might be mitigated if one feels that these changed conditions, which Rousseau calls the state of society, and which, for our purposes, might be better rendered as civilization, are more likely than not preferable to the conditions our species initially called home, namely nature, or, for Rousseau and his contemporaries, the state of nature. After all, most of us sense that we would not really be equipped to live outside of civilization, that we not only have wants and desires that we could not satisfy in such a condition, but indeed needs that only civilization allows us to meet. Rousseau would agree with that. He knew that nature does not go backwards. But his point is that our species once consisted of beings who were perfectly equipped by nature to live in nature, and therefore perfectly happy, and his account of the way in which we have developed our capacities as a species drastically relativizes pretty much everything his contemporaries, perhaps us too, would consider as unique achievements of civilization. His discourse, as I will suggest to you tonight, forces us to take seriously the question on what grounds we can reasonably give preference to the present, civilization, over the past, nature. In other words, Rousseau raises the problem of historical judgment. How should we judge this new environment our species accidentally created for itself, society? And in consequence, how should we judge the history of our species? In order for this question to emerge in seriousness, Rousseau first needs to disabuse his readers of all sorts of prejudices about the state of nature, prejudices that distort the comparison between nature and civilization that such a judgment relies on. Rousseau found these prejudices in the writings of his fellow philosophers who, like him, had tried to find the reasons underlying the transition from life in nature, the state of nature, to life in society, and who, again like him, faced the difficulty of having to do so in the absence of any direct historical evidence that could inform us of these reasons. What did they consider as the characteristics of the novel form of life? Let me give you a rough enumeration. Agriculture as the basis of subsistence, private property, a division of labor leading to specialization and consequently to the emergence of the arts and sciences, technological advancement, codes of justice, political unification, and political and social inequality. In contemporary language, these philosophers were trying to identify the causes of what is today referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. That is, the transition of human communities from hunting and gathering to agriculture as the basis of subsistence, without which, as is still believed today, the emergence of civilization as a distinct social form could not have happened. Now, the idea that there has been a fundamental change in the way our species lives, a change that involved, amongst other things, the emergence of agriculture, and with it the necessity of labor, of interhuman conflict, and therefore eventually of political rule, was itself, of course, not new at the time. We can find this idea, for instance, in Hesiod's poem Work and Days, in which the period before this change is called the Golden Age, and in Genesis, which Rousseau, like Kant and Hegel after him, might have considered to not contain merely theological, but also historical truth. But starting in the century before Rousseau, for reasons that I will not expound on here, but that I'm happy to talk about during our discussion, philosophers had become very interested in discovering the causes and mechanisms that were responsible for the emergence of civilization in human history. In other words, what united philosophers like Hobbes, Pufendorf, and Rousseau is that they all regarded society as an in some way artificial institution, meaning an institution that did not emerge out of a natural desire to live together with others, that does not constitute a natural telos for human beings. Moreover, they also shared the conviction that the establishment of society had involved certain trade-offs, most importantly, the introduction of inequality of status. For Hobbes, Pufendorf, and Rousseau all assumed that humans were by nature equal, that inequality was therefore artificial or human-made, and the loss of natural liberty, that is, the introduction of codes of law that restrict human behavior in one way or another. Therefore, one's account of the circumstances under which society emerged had an immediate bearing on the question whether the inequalities that characterized societies were legitimate, or, in the language of the Academy of Dijon, who posed the question Rousseau responded to in his second discourse, whether the inequality among men is, quote, authorized by natural law, unquote. Now, Rousseau's criticism of Hobbes and Pufendorf's accounts concerns the specific way in which they modeled the emergence of civilizations, since, according to him, their method already skewed the comparison between nature and civilization in favor of the latter, and thereby gave nature a rather bad reputation. Like Rousseau after them, Hobbes and Pufendorf had both tried to explain a general, if not universal, phenomenon, since civilizations had emerged across time and space. Therefore, the emergence of civilization could not be due to merely contingent or accidental causes. However, Hobbes and Pufendorf wanted to give a naturalistic and logical account of this development. They did not think it sound to assume that humans, at some point in history, began to live in societies out of a natural inclination to live with other humans. Such a natural inclination or social impulse could certainly be observed, but it could not explain why humans would give up natural equality and natural liberty. Moreover, one could also observe a whole array of antisocial impulses in human behavior: greed, violence, betrayal, cruelty, and so on. Thus, there had to be a functional explanation for the emergence of society. It had to be an institution that, at some point in history, became necessary or at least clearly advantageous. Society had to have been the solution to a problem that prevailed in the state of nature, and, since we are considering a universal phenomenon, this problem must itself have been universally present, and therefore, in one way or another, rooted in human nature itself. Without going into too much detail, Hobbes and Pufendorf explain this necessity of society in different ways by characterizing the state of nature as detrimental for human survival. For Hobbes, the state of nature was famously a state of war, in which life was nasty, brutish, and short, since one had to be constantly prepared for an attack from other humans. Pufendorf, on the other hand, depicted the state of nature as a state of want, in which humans were unable to satisfy their basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter without the help of other humans. Both Hobbes and Pufendorf, thus, argued that societies emerged historically as a consequence of the demand of human self-preservation, that humans were, by their very nature, unable to survive in nature, either due to their unruly passions and instincts, which reason eventually taught them to override, that's Hobbes, or due to their physical needs, which reason eventually taught them to satisfy through cooperation with others, that's Pufendorf. Rousseau, however, thought that this was a contradictory position. For if humans were by nature unable to survive without society, in what sense can society still be regarded as an artificial institution? If societies arose due to the requirements of the preservation of the species, would that not mean that humans are, in fact, after all, destined by nature to live in society? Moreover, if societies emerged historically through a long learning process, how did the human species even survive this period of time? Another implication of both these explanations, which present the emergence of society as a response to problems issuing from human nature itself, is that society, despite the disadvantages that attend it, immediately appears as justified. History, in this construction, appears like a long learning process in which humans, endowed with a fixed set of needs, and immersed in a stable external environment, slowly but surely figured out how to live better. The initial obstacles to human survival, perhaps also flourishing, most importantly interhuman conflict and scarcity of resources, are here located in humans' unchanging passions, instincts, and needs, and reason is conceived as providing solutions to the impasses that follow from these features. From this perspective, the question how one ought to, as Rousseau says, judge the present state, the state of society, indeed hardly arises. The preferability of civilization is here indeed a predetermined outcome. Now, it is important to note that Rousseau concedes that society is, at present, in fact necessary for the preservation of the species. Even men like himself, Rousseau says in the second discourse, cannot simply, quote, reclaim their first innocence, annihilate thine and mine, and go back to live in forests with bears, nor can they do without laws and chiefs. But Rousseau insists that this must be due to a change in circumstances throughout time. The need for society and the necessity of the political state is a fact. However, according to Rousseau, it is a consequence of other prior developments which were not necessary. In the second discourse, Rousseau gives an account of these very developments or changes that have indeed made society necessary for human survival. So how does Rousseau account for the emergence of civilization? In the opening pages of the second discourse, he tells us that the first task consists in figuring out what the state of nature was actually like. And for that, in turn, we need to understand what our quote-unquote original nature was really like. Thus, Rousseau invokes the old demand for humans to know themselves and identifies this self-knowledge with knowledge of our first nature before it was transformed by, quote, times and circumstances, unquote. This is a confusing demand when you think about it, for it is not immediately clear what purpose this knowledge could possibly serve. Recall that Rousseau claimed that our original human nature was forever lost, forever transformed, and therefore irrecoverable. Yet Rousseau insists that it is this kind of self-knowledge that is necessary to properly judge the present state, the state of society. But how is one to figure out what this original human nature was like if there are no original humans around anymore? Well, Rousseau begins by modeling the sort of environment that quote-unquote natural man had to live and survive in. And he deduces the features of original human nature from the demands their environment would have imposed on them. This approach follows from a philosophical anthropology that considers the satisfaction of needs as the principal rationale for the development of human reason, and consequently conceptualizes man's relationship to his environment is mediated by the task of human self-reproduction. Everything, Rousseau says, is reduced at first to subsistence, and from that man is attached to everything that surrounds him. He depends on everything, and he becomes what everything he depends on forces him to be. Let me explain this in a little more detail. Rousseau considers reason and passion not as opposites, but rather as functionally related capacities whose concrete formation is dependent on particular environments. In his conception, reason constitutes a practice-oriented faculty that was, at least initially, aimed at the goal of self-preservation and consequently at need satisfaction. In other words, humans, just like other animals, necessarily relate to their environment with a certain kind of intentionality, or as Rousseau calls it, with a certain concern, namely their own self-preservation. Our senses are consequently instruments for the satisfaction of needs on the one hand and for the avoidance of danger on the other, and it is on this basis of this central reason that intellectual reason subsequently develops in humans. The important role of the passions is due to the fact that they make us feel our needs and thereby motivate us to pursue their satisfaction, which, in some situations, prompts the further development of reason. Therefore, reason is not only and perhaps not even primarily, a faculty that allows us to restrain our passions, but it is also a product of their activity. And the passions have to be considered as rational, since they are meant to indicate our needs to us and to prompt us to respond to them. Finally, the relationship between reason, passion, and needs is not unidirectional. Just as the activity of the passions prompts the development of reason, so the development of reason, and here especially of the faculty of imagination, leads to the further development of our desires and, over time, of our needs. From this perspective, the puzzle why our species left the state of nature turns on the question what sort of needs it is plausible to ascribe to humans in the state of nature and under what circumstances they had to satisfy those needs. So what did the natural environment humans lived in during the state of nature that humans depended on force humans to be? This brings us to what is sometimes called Rousseau's 3 stages model of human history. I will try really hard to not get too technical here, but I will have to ask you to bear with me while I try to summarize what I regard as the most important points of this model for you. When I go a little bit more into detail, it's because I want to illustrate the interplay of reason, passion, and needs that I have outlined rather abstractly, concretely for you. I want to show you how Rousseau actually imagines this works. So Rousseau generally distinguishes between 3 different modes of subsistence that prevailed throughout human history. First, foraging and hunting. These were next supplemented by herding, and then, finally, agriculture. Each of these modes interacts with human nature by producing historically specific needs and situationally specific difficulties. That is, each of these environments shapes us in definite ways, forces us to be a certain kind of being. It is important to note that Rousseau deploys the term state of nature to describe all forms of human life prior to what he calls the division of the earth amongst men, that is, before the establishment of property relations. So hunting and herding both take place during the state of nature, while plowing, agriculture, belongs to the state of society. Rousseau's account begins during the early phase of the state of nature, when humans lived an animal existence and satisfied their, at this point, exclusively physical needs by gathering fruits and nuts. In this condition, Rousseau claims humans were essentially animals, devoid of self-consciousness and unproblematically embedded in nature as a whole. Feeding on what the earth provides, humans make up for their relative physical inferiority compared to other animals, with the help of their adaptive powers. The human capacity for adaptation, and thus for development, is due to the only faculty which, according to Rousseau, distinguishes the human species from other animal species at this point. This faculty, according to Rousseau, is not reason, but rather the faculty of perfectibility. Rousseau defines perfectibility as, quote, a faculty which, with the aid of circumstances, successively develops all the others and resides among us as much in the species as in the individual, end quote. Importantly, perfectibility is not a teleological category. It does not mean that we are moving towards a predetermined goal. It rather means something like, perhaps not infinite, but very considerable adaptability, the capacity or freedom of human animals to change over time, to become different than they were. In a way, perfectibility means that we are not as determined by natural instinct, and thus by nature, as other animals are. We are free, as Rousseau says, to resist and act against the voice of nature, and, as a consequence, to become different, to change our nature. However, there is nothing that makes these changes necessarily desirable. Perfectibility rather accounts for our species' capacity to change as such, for better or for worse. Thus, Rousseau thought that the development of human faculties operates through the interaction of perfectibility with external circumstances, which primarily consist in challenges to the procurement of subsistence. At the very beginning of the state of nature, humans had to become agile, quick, and strong so as to compete with animals for resources and protect themselves from being preyed upon. In the very beginning, humans were thus not even hunters, but only foragers. Indeed, Rousseau argues that the transition from gathering to hunting and fishing, activities that at least require rudimentary tools, must have been precipitated by the onset of an additional set of novel difficulties, which arose as a consequence either of population growth or of migration into different climates. Forced to survive in less naturally fertile environments, humans now began to use different natural objects as tools that enabled them to fish and hunt, and through a fortuitous accident, possibly lightning or a volcano outbreak, eventually learned how to make fire. By interacting with their environment in this novel way, that is, hunting, tool-making, a way that involves the handling of objects, humans gradually developed the cognitive capacity of relational thinking, that is, of comparing different objects and perceiving relations between these objects and themselves. This allows them to develop a sort of self-conception different from animal consciousness, and consequently also an ability to recognize other humans as animals with which they share a likeness. Now, no longer subsisting solely by foraging, but also by hunting and fishing, humans begin to have intercourse with members of their own species, even though this intercourse was of an occasional nature and not prompted by any necessity of permanent mutual aid. Gradually, and as Rousseau says, over multitudes of centuries, humans begin to consciously furnish tools with which they build rudimentary huts, and eventually enter the second state in Rousseau's model, a state that I like to call the state of culture. With the transition from a nomadic to a sedentary lifestyle, which Rousseau refers to as the epoch of a first revolution, humans, for the first time in history, begin to live socially, that is, in permanent proximity to other humans in the form of extended families, and they consequently acquire those qualities that make humans recognizably human. This change to a permanent social form of life is responsible for the development of human culture. It accounts for the first emergence of language, song, dance, social norms of interaction, and so on. Moreover, by living together with members of their species, humans over time acquire a new capacity, what Rousseau calls moral love. In contrast to physical love, which is a temporary passion aimed at the satisfaction of sexual appetite, moral love is characterized by a sentiment of preference for a particular human being. This sentiment is no longer purely instinctual, but based on what Rousseau calls ideas of merit and beauty, ideas which can only arise through the repeated consideration and comparison of different objects. And by beginning to see others as particular human beings characterized by particular qualities, humans also develop a relative sense of self through the continuous interactions with members of their species. This is indicated by the emergence of a novel kind of self-love, amour-propre, which constitutes a relative sentiment. I prefer myself to someone else. I seek to increase my standing relative to someone else. I want the person I love to prefer me to others. Therefore, amour-propre presupposes the existence of a concept of self. The emergence of self-consciousness, in turn, occasions the development of a new kind of need, namely of moral rather than physical needs. For instance, the need to have one's self-conception affirmed and recognized by others, the need to have standing in a community, and indeed, the need to be loved by those who one loves. Moral needs are those kinds of needs for whose satisfaction one necessarily relies on others, and for this reason, their emergence signals the end of man's complete self-sufficiency. Finally, the change from an absolute to a relative self of sense also gives interhuman conflict an additional dimension. For once individuals had developed a sense of self and moral needs, they began, if you will, to take things personally. And what before might have constituted a simple injury now became an insult. This not only necessitated the development of the first mores and duties of civility, but also made humans generally, as Rousseau says, bloodthirsty and cruel. All of these developments thus resulted in the generation of novel practical requirements, namely to regulate social life through the introduction of a system of norms and punishments, and it necessitated the development of new human qualities. Humans had to become the kinds of beings who could conform to social norms. Thus, with the transition to social life, humans begin to actively create an environment that is not only subject to the dynamics of natural processes, but also to rules that are generated by human beings themselves. And despite the somewhat violent consequences of this development, humans were now bloodthirsty and cruel, Rousseau refers to the state of culture as the golden age of human history, as the most happy and durable epoch. However, despite this apparent stability of the second stage of history, in some places a third state emerges, the state of society. This development was, according to Rousseau, triggered by the introduction of a social division of labor. Yet Rousseau thinks that this introduction was due to a contingent rather than a necessary development, most likely to the accidental discovery of metallurgy, possibly following the outbreak of a volcano. What is the state of society like? Well, I'm going to take the liberty now to read you a long Rousseau quote because it's a fantastic summary of what he thinks about the state of society, and you also get a sense of, the way Rousseau expresses himself. So Rousseau sums up the state of society like this. As long as men applied themselves only to tasks that a single person could do, and to arts that did not require the cooperation of several hands, they lived free, healthy, good, and happy insofar as they could be according to their nature, and they continued to enjoy amongst themselves the sweetness of independent intercourse. But from the moment one man needed the help of another, as soon as they observed that it was useful for a single person to have provisions for two, equality disappeared, property was introduced, labor became necessary, and vast forests were changed into smiling fields which had to be watered with the sweat of man, and in which slavery and misery were soon seen to germinate and grow with the crops." End quote. This then is Rousseau's rather depressing description of the state of society. A state characterized by property, government, laws, misery, crimes, social conflict, and social domination. How, one might ask, could a practice like the division of labor possibly be responsible for such a host of negative consequences? Well, technically speaking, it is not the division of labor as such that Rousseau held responsible, but rather its interaction with the mode of subsistence it required, which is agriculture. See, Rousseau thought that the division of labor required a surplus of storable food, since if some people are occupied with tasks other than the production of food, others have to produce the subsistence of these people in addition to their own. And the only mode of subsistence suited to meet this demand, according to Rousseau, was agriculture. But the shift to agriculture meant that human beings now became dependent on one another for the satisfaction of their physical needs. From now on, one part of a community ceased to be self-sufficient and began to depend on another part for the production of their subsistence. In Emile, Rousseau makes explicit another aspect of this shift, namely that this arrangement also, for the first time in the history of the human species, makes possible the emergence of what Marx and others would later refer to as class society, that is, a form of social organization in which one part of the population produces not only its own subsistence, but also that of a ruling elite. For, as Rousseau says, as soon as part of mankind rests, it is necessary that the joint efforts of those who work make up for the idleness of those who do nothing. Of course, this idleness, i.e. the freedom from having to spend the majority of one's time on procuring one's daily subsistence, is also necessary for the emergence of the arts and sciences, of organized religion, of political elites, and thus of civilization itself. Additionally, Rousseau regarded mutual physical dependence as the condition for the emergence of permanent relations of domination and servitude. Indeed, he argued that in the absence of reciprocal needs that unite man, even the law of the stronger is without much consequence, since it is impossible to enslave a man without first putting him in the position of being unable to do without another. Finally, the institutionalization of large-scale agriculture necessitated, according to Rousseau, the emergence of a concept of property in land. This is because the practice of agriculture requires trust that one's harvest is secure during one's absence. In contrast to both modes of subsistence that preceded agriculture, hunting, gathering, and herding, the cultivation of land involves a sustained expenditure of labor whose rewards cannot be immediately reaped. As Rousseau puts it, when the Cyclops has rolled the stone in front of the entrance to his cave, his herds and he are secure. But who would look after the harvest of him who the laws do not watch over? In other words, agriculture requires that people refrain from reaping the fruits of other people's labor. And Rousseau speculates that it was only a small step from this novel practice of continuous possession of land to the emergence of the idea of property in land. With a finite amount of arable land now constituting the primary means of subsistence, the earth was soon, quote, covered by thine and mine, unquote, and someone who wanted to become self-sufficient found it impossible to subsist. This, according to Rousseau, leads to a structural and therefore permanent conflict between those who have property in land and those who do not, a conflict that engendered what he calls a frightful disorder and therefore eventually necessitated the establishment of political rule, which, in Rousseau's words, destroyed natural freedom for all time and established forever the law of property and inequality. This, then, is the history of our species, as Rousseau gives it to us. You might by now not be surprised to hear that Rousseau tells his readers at the beginning of his book that he expects that this history will make them, quote, wish their species had stopped, unquote. For once one does away with the assumption that life in civilization constitutes a natural end, or telos for our species, that is, to return to Louis Menand's formulation, that it does constitute an end or goal that was given to our species at the beginning of its life, one finds oneself in a position in which one has to judge the history of our species. That is, pronounce whether its exit from the state of nature was in fact really such a good idea in light of the consequences this exit entails. According to Rousseau, these consequences are disease, inequality, loss of self-sufficiency, mutual dependence, slavery, and social domination. But how would the task of judging this history even work? In other words, in the absence of a natural goal or end for our species, what standard of judgment could we possibly deploy? I suppose one possibility is to think about things in utilitarian terms. That is, was our exit from nature worth it, if you will, because it was useful for humanity? Has it made humanity happier, perhaps because it has made life more convenient? Rousseau's history does not allow for this conclusion, for where others see in history a record of our growing ability to satisfy natural needs, Rousseau sees in these accomplishments a kind of zero-sum game. The needs of civil man, of humans who live in civilization, are, to a large extent, self-induced, and the usefulness of the products of the development of reason, by which civil men satisfy these needs, is not absolute but relative. In other words, Rousseau turns the accomplishments of scientific and technological developments into symptoms of self-created problems. Indeed, all of society's products, which are so necessary to civil men, would be absolutely useless to natural men. For instance, if natural man had no language, it is because there was no need for him as a self-sufficient being to communicate with his fellows. Consequently, the invention of language becomes a symptom of a need that had not hitherto existed before, and additionally, a mark of the loss of self-sufficiency. Similarly, if natural man was not knowledgeable in, say, the art of medicine, it is because there were virtually no illnesses that needed to be cured in the state of nature. For Rousseau held that most illnesses that plague humans living in society stem from the unhealthy lifestyle that is prevalent in society. Again, not only would natural man have no use for the medical arts developed in civilization, but the production of this type of knowledge, furthermore, becomes an index of the self-inflicted pathologies of this form of life. Finally, if natural man lacked protection by the law, it is because there was nothing he needed to be protected from. For without mutual dependence and private property, the right of the stronger in the state of nature is really without much consequence. From this perspective, the achievements of civilization lose their glittering quality. Granted, the development of our capacities might indeed enable us to master increasingly complex problems, but what is the value of this if these problems are themselves the result of the development of these very capacities and the novel needs they created? If the conveniences of society constitute nothing more than remedies for self-inflicted needs, on what basis can one give preference to this form of life over life in nature? But perhaps the emergence of civilization can be justified on moral grounds. After all, pre-social humanity, Rousseau grants, lacked virtues and vices, since in the absence of social relationships and known duties, quote, there can be no good or evil, unquote. Could the emergence of morality, and thus also of moral freedom, be regarded as an accomplishment in itself? Rousseau replies that a judgment of society in such terms would require a careful evaluation of, quote, whether there are more virtues than vices amongst civilized men, or whether their virtues are more advantageous than their vices are deadly, and crucially, whether all things considered, humans would not be in a happier situation having neither harm to fear nor good to hope from anyone. Once the state of nature and that of society are compared without prejudice, as Rousseau says, there is no good reason to prefer society over nature. Where others see in history a continuous progress in the development of reason and the accumulation of knowledge, the Rousseauian point of view turns this progress into an index of unreason and apprehends it negatively as an indicator for the constantly increasing needfulness and weakness of human beings. Where Hobbes and Pufendorf see humanity's exit from the state of nature as necessary and thus rational and justified, Rousseau's standpoint reveals humanity's history as profoundly irrational, devoid of purpose, and really altogether rather unfortunate. What are we to make of this history? What is its purpose? What I would like to suggest to you is that Rousseau's history of our species tasks us in a specific way. Namely, it tasks us to think about what would need to happen for our judgment of this history and our sentiment while considering it to change. After all, history is itself not a static thing, but rather a relation, a way in which we account for our present by relating it to a past. What Rousseau makes clear, I believe, is that history, our species' exit from the state of nature and all its consequences, cannot be justified from the standpoint of his present. But perhaps justification is not the right category. After all, justification constitutes a theoretical rather than a practical activity. To justify is to argue that something is or was reasonable and therefore right. With respect to history, justification is retrospective, and to justify the history of our species, unfortunately, often means to rationalize the victims of this history, and there are many, and our own dissatisfaction with what this history has led to, namely the present. But perhaps what this history demands of us is not justification. Perhaps what it demands of us is rather redemption. For redemption refers to a practical activity. To redeem is to compensate for past actions, to atone, or to fulfill a past promise or potential. What would our present need to be like for us to be able to look at this history and pronounce that it was indeed worth it, and thereby perhaps to free ourselves from it? This is a difficult question, but I would like to leave you with this thought. According to Rousseau, our exit from nature was only possible because of this perhaps questionable gift we received from nature, namely perfectibility, the freedom to become something different than what one is, the freedom to change. In light of the consequences that perfectibility led to, namely history, one might say that it is in fact perfectibility, and thus nature itself, that demands redemption of us, and that by redeeming history, we would in fact also redeem nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Picker. We'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll start a question period in the room just over here to your left, to my right. Thank you very much to the Summer Academy students. I wish you a lovely rest of the week, and I look forward to seeing many of you in the question period in 5 or so minutes.